In lesson 1, I talked about how embarrassed I am that I got the flu this year. And what I'm going to do about it is do this expansion and improvement of my organic garden so I have more nutrient-dense food next winter to make sure I don't get the flu again, and not to mention other more serious diseases. In lesson 2, I talked about the main benefits of implementing this checklist, which are bringing in much more nutritious food with considerably better flavor, sizably greater yields, and substantially longer storage life. And our main goals when we are doing the things in this checklist are to increase the number and diversity of beneficial organisms in our garden and to bring more nutrition into the garden. So in short, that's biology and chemistry. In lesson 3, I talked about how plants manufacture various compounds for their own health, which are also really important for our health, but they need an optimal environment in order to be able to do that. And that's where this checklist comes in. And now on to step 4, the checklist, which you'll be able to download below this video after you're done watching it. And so the checklist starts out kind of more biology focused and gradually moves more chemistry focused, but there's a lot of overlap and many of the steps will provide both for the garden. What I'm going to be doing is pulling some videos out of my online organic gardening course, the Smiling Gardener Academy, that I'll be playing while I'm talking through the checklist so you can see a little bit better example of what I'm talking about. The first one is compost, and this one's always near the top of the list. We bring in compost partially because it brings in nutrition, but mainly because it brings in the beneficial biology that improves our soil, feeds our plants, and controls pests in the garden. Even just a little bit, just a 1/4 inch of compost dusted over the garden is more than you need, as long as it's good compost. And so that's why it's a good idea to be making your own compost, because you can learn how to do a really good job. So if you're not currently compost, I really encourage you to make it priority number 1. The next one is compost tea. And even though I'm using compost every year in my garden, I still bring in compost tea even just a couple of times a year, because what I can do is take this really small amount of good compost and turn it into a potent probiotic that I bring into my soil to shift the biological balance of my soil and bring onto my plant leaves, where it can protect the leaves, feed them, and help control and prevent some pests there. So what you do is take a small amount of good compost, put it in a bucket of clean water, add in some foods to feed the microorganisms like molasses and maybe some liquid kelp, and then importantly, you put an air pump, a powerful air pump into that water, bubble oxygen through it for 24 hours, and then you can apply that to the garden. Next is effective microorganisms, or EM. And I use this a lot more in my garden than compost tea, not because it's necessarily better, but it does bring in a very important smaller set of microorganisms that are really helpful for garden health. So I actually use this as the base for my monthly foliar sprays, and it really just helps keep the garden healthy and also helps prevent a lot of pest problems. So I have an email I got from an Academy member named Becky who said, "This year my new peach trees are lush and have peaches on them. I use the foliar sprays you suggest and no holes in the leaves like last year. My strawberries now have leaves that are huge and lots of berries coming on. Same with my grapevine. Flowers are happy and so is my lawn." And so that's just one example of how these monthly foliar sprays that we do are really helpful for just making a lot of good things happen in the garden. Next is mycorrhizal fungi. And I use a powder form of these fungi every time I'm planting any plants or sowing any seeds in my garden. And what they do is they protect the roots from soil predators, and they bring water and nutrients right into the roots. So I use a product for this because it makes it really easy, a purchase product. But what you can do if you don't want to purchase a product is go into a really healthy natural ecosystem that's similar to the one you're trying to create in your garden. Grab just a handful of healthy soil from there and use that as your inoculant. Next is a herbal tea, which you make by filling a bucket very loosely with weeds from your garden, and then filling that with clean water, putting a tight lid on it, and letting it ferment for a few days to a few weeks. When that's done, you can strain out the weeds, mix that remaining liquid with 10 to 20 parts water, and water your plants with it. It smells really bad, but it brings some nutrition into your plants and often gives them quite a boost and can be helpful for preventing and controlling some diseases as well. The next one is urine. And by my math, if you can pee in your garden once or twice per year for every 5 square feet, you're going to supply all of the nitrogen needs of your garden plus other nutrients as well. If you are healthy and you're not on any really toxic medication, your urine is going to be non-toxic as well, so there's nothing to worry about. It's a great nitrogen fertilizer. The next one is mulch, and I try to keep my garden beds mulched all the time. If I have an option, I use leaves that have fallen in autumn onto my property or near the property. And what they do is they break down slowly, they enrich the soil, they stop weeds, they conserve moisture, they do a lot of good. If I don't have weeds, the next best option is straw, which I can get from an organic farmer or a garden center. And wood chips can also work as well, but more so in a perennial planting than in an annual vegetable garden. The next one is cover crops. Cover crops do even more to improve the health of your garden because they're growing. Their roots are going down into the soil, often very deeply, doing a lot of good to improve soil health. Their shoots are coming up, attracting beneficial insects, sometimes repelling pests, and so they do a lot of good. Legumes are great to use, such as vetch and clover. Grasses are also common, my favorites being annual ryegrass, cereal rye. I really like to use oats in my climate. Legumes and grasses are often mixed together as well. And then there are other beneficial plants. So in my garden, if a plant isn't providing me with benefits directly, it's providing some other benefits to the garden. My main recommendations are to plant a lot of legumes because they bring nitrogen into your garden. That's like the clover and vetch I talked about before, also lupins. The next on the list are accumulators that will get nutrients from the soil and make them available to other plants. That's going to be like borage, yarrow, nettles. And then the last on the list are plants to bring in and attract beneficial insects and sometimes to repel insects too. A lot of these are herbs, many herbs do this, things like mint, dill, marigolds. If I had to choose one beneficial plant to plant liberally throughout the garden, it would be garlic. It attracts beneficial insects, it repels many different pests, and it can be stored by you throughout the year to use as a highly potent medicine. Plus, you can make a really effective natural pesticide out of it by taking just a clove of garlic, crushing it, marinating it in half a teaspoon of some kind of vegetable oil for 24 hours, then just mixing that with half a teaspoon of soap, a liter of water, and spraying that on the infested plants in the morning. The next one is ocean water. This is definitely my favorite fertilizer. It has over 90 minerals in it, plus beneficial living biology. So it's great to bring it into your soil and directly onto your plants to boost the nutrition of your food. I use an ocean water product because I don't live by the ocean. It's very concentrated. If you do live by the ocean, you can go and get 5 liters of ocean water, mix it with 50 liters of regular water, and water that over 1,000 square feet 4 times a year. For my product, I just take 1/3 of a cup instead of 5 liters. So it ends up being about 60 times less being applied because it's just so dense. But either way, you're going to get these benefits. What I do is I mix it regularly with my EM and apply them together over the garden. I have a note from another Academy member named Joe who told me, "We now have done this foliar spray twice on the winter crops and the results are pretty spectacular. I had to go back and do a 3rd hit on the curly kale, which was not doing much, but it's now jumping." So I especially like using these foliar sprays when I'm working on, in the first few years of a garden, when I'm working on improving the soil, but it's just not there yet. The foliar sprays can bring in that nutrition and that biology I really need. The next one is rock dust, and this is just simply rocks that have been ground up into a powder. You want to look for ideally a volcanic dust or a glacial dust, as they have the most nutrition. And what you do is just even 50 pounds applied over 1,000 square feet is going to bring broad spectrum nutrition into the garden. If you have a bigger garden and are willing to do a little bit of searching, it's great to go to a quarry and find a dust. You have to test it out a little bit to make sure it's a good one, but you can save a lot of money that way. If you have a smaller garden, you can just buy it in bags and use it that way. The next one is seaweed. And again, if I still live by the ocean, I would go get some seaweed, bring it into my garden. It's about the most perfect source of organic matter you can use to mulch the soil and include in a compost pile. These days, I'm using a liquid fertilizer made out of seaweed. I still get to bring these nutrients and other beneficial substances in seaweed into my garden. My soil doesn't benefit as much from the liquid, but my plants really do. Seaweed helps them handle many different stressors in their environment, and so I can get really instant results same day by spraying the liquid right onto the plants. Next one is neem oil, and neem oil is really interesting because it seems to act both as a biostimulant, improving plant health, but also controlling plant predators, insects, and diseases. And I'm careful about bringing anything into my garden that controls insects and diseases because I worry that it will harm some beneficials. But I've never found any evidence that it's harmful to bees and butterflies. I have seen though how plants respond really well to it. So what I do is I just bring it in twice per year, usually early spring and late spring, especially on plants that really seem to benefit from it, like fruit trees really especially seem to. And if you are doing this, you want to use cold pressed pure neem oil. The next one is soil testing. And I know a lot of people skip this one, but it's the only way to know which minerals your soil needs more of. So many of the things we've been talking about today are great for bringing in broad spectrum nutrition, many different minerals, but sometimes our soil needs a greater quantity of just a certain couple or few minerals. And so that's when we bring in specific rocks like maybe gypsum, but only when we know we need the minerals that are in them. So what you can do is send a small soil sample to an organically minded lab and they'll help you figure out which of these fertilizers to use. Or if you're in my academy, you can send it to me and I'll help you with that. The next one is an exception to the soil testing rule, and that is about calcium and phosphorus. If you're just not going to do a soil test, I recommend bringing in 10 pounds of calcium carbonate and 5 pounds of soft rock phosphate per 1,000 square feet. Ideally, you'd bring it in with a little bit of compost and incorporate them all into the top few inches of soil. And the reason we want to do this is because most of our soils are deficient in calcium and phosphorus, and they're just so incredibly important for garden health. I saved the most important one for last, and that's water. There's no amount of compost, microbial inoculant, or organic fertilizer that's going to bring your garden to optimal health unless it also has optimal water. If you do implement many of the steps in this checklist, they're going to be helping to dramatically increase your soil's water holding capacity. So in the future, you won't have to supply nearly as much water. But in the meantime, it's important that your plants have access to water. So those are the steps I'm really excited to start working on in my garden next month. If you have any questions about any of them, feel free to ask down below. And I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd share this with someone who you think would benefit from it. I hope you've enjoyed this series this week. I hope this checklist is useful for you this year. I'm going to be disappearing into the academy for a while to work with my new members in there, help them improve their gardens this year. And then at some point, I'll be back doing something for the blog as well. And that's all for today. Take care.